And we are live, so if you're on Facebook, you can leave questions in the comments below, and I'll flag them up to Atia Stokes-Brown, who is our presenter today for DEI 101. And we will get started in just a minute. I'm going to turn it over to Atia, who's going to give you the rest of the housekeeping that you need to know about before she gets started with her presentation. So thank you, Atia, for being here with us. Atia, if you don't know, is also the chair of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council. And so we're so grateful for the expertise that you have in this and for everything that you're going to share with us today. Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Amanda. It's a pleasure to be here today and a pleasure to be here with all of you. We are all in this virtual world, so I will share with you that via Zoom, I'm not able to see everyone, which is always interesting when you're engaging in these kinds of interactive transformative dialogues. So I want you all to be aware of that, but I also want you to be aware that despite that limitation, this is designed to be an interactive format. And so please feel free throughout this dialogue at any point if you have any questions, so please share those. So Amanda mentioned you can share questions in the Facebook. She will be monitoring that. Also via Zoom, there's a chat function, so please feel free to write questions there, and we will also be able to address those. But throughout the presentation, if you have questions, and again, you are in the Zoom, feel free to unmute yourself and I can answer questions that way as well. Otherwise, if you don't have questions, particularly in Zoom, go ahead and put your mic on mute. That will allow us to minimize any background noise and make sure that everyone can be heard. So again, it is my pleasure to be here with you. My name is Atia Stokes-Brown, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Coastal Carolina University. But I also have the pleasure of serving as the Chair for the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council at the Myrtle Beach Area Chamber of Commerce. And so we are very excited, our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council, we're very excited to present to our community one of the many things that we want to do for our community. And one of the things that we're presenting today is our EVOLVE series. EVOLVE stands for Educated Voices on Leading and Valuing Equity. And so our goal with this educational series is to provide an opportunity for members of our community to learn more about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and particularly to begin to think about how to infuse and embed aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion into their organizations. So that's what we're going to focus on today. Today is the first of many in our series. And as you can see here, the title for our work today is Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion 101, First Steps to Creating Transformative Change in the Workplace. So what are we going to do today? In our hour and a half together today, what we're going to do is we're going to provide a clear understanding of what diversity, equity, and inclusion is, right? Like, what are these concepts? What are they not, right? It's really important for us to develop a common language and understanding of these key concepts if we're going to embed them into our organizations. We're also going to raise some awareness and sensitivities to diversity, equity, and inclusion issues that go well beyond assumed categories. So this is going to be an opportunity for us to dive deep and think about our own cultural competence. What is our cultural knowledge? What are we aware of? What are we unaware of? What are our biases? What are our lenses? And how might we need to think about, on an individual level, expanding our knowledge to then be able to embed DEI in our organizations. And then finally, we're also going to talk a bit today about strategies and actionable ways to increase workplace inclusivity. And we're going to do that from multiple lenses. We're going to be thinking about how an organization can do that. And again, in our series, we'll have more information that'll help us think about that from an organizational standpoint. But it's also important for us to recognize that as organizations or companies that we represent or perhaps own or work for, we are individuals embedded in those organizations. And so the work that we need to do is not just at an institutional level, it's also at an individual level. And so we're going to talk quite a bit today about the work that we need to do as individuals to then be able to transform the places in which we work. So let's go ahead and get started. It's really important for us to recognize, before we even dive into some definitions, it's important to recognize that there are unique benefits for embedding diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. And so you can see here, there is pressure for companies and organizations to embrace diversity and to support a more equitable and inclusive workplace, right? And this is not just a social trend. So we perhaps can think about this from different perspectives, right? There's sort of a moral and societal perspective to make sure that the places that we work and the places that we live, that they look more like the society in which we live in, and that society is definitely more diverse and inclusive than it's ever been before. So there's definitely that moral or social imperative. But we could also argue that there's an economic imperative for organizations and for companies to embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion. So as you can see here, there's some top reasons for cultivating DEI in the workplace, right? And again, we've talked about it's the right thing to do. And if we look at various studies of organizations across the country, there is a prevailing belief among those leaders that they have a responsibility to just go beyond profit, right? To really build organizations that reflect society, build organizations that in terms of representation really reflect the diversity that we see. They also do believe that their organizations or companies should be making an impact in their society, right? That they should be part of perhaps community building, that they should be part of establishing a better society, not just in their local neighborhoods and communities, but within the nation as a whole. So there definitely is that reason. That's a top reason to do this. But companies also recognize that it's a smart thing to do. And so what we know from various studies, and there's one cited here, but what we know from various studies is that companies that do the work of embedding diversity, equity, and inclusion into their organizations, they actually do better. Right? And this is from an economic or business perspective in terms of thinking about profit. So companies, for example, that are more gender diverse, as you can see here, are 21% more likely to outperform others. Those that are ethnically diverse, right? Thinking in terms of race and ethnicity, they're 33% more likely to outperform others. So we do have some data here that confirms that when we do the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, thinking about issues of representation, but then even going so far in terms of our policies and our policies and our practices to make sure that we're creating an equitable and inclusive workspace, that actually pays off for companies, that actually contributes to their bottom line. So with that being said, let's talk about these key concepts and let's define them. So what is diversity? Diversity at its core focuses on presence, right? So who's in the space? So when you think about your company or your organization, who do you see? Who's represented? And there are multiple ways in which we can think about who's present, right? And we can use a framework of identity. So when we're thinking about who's present in the space, are we talking about it from a lens of gender, in terms of gender identity and expression, as well as sex? Are we talking about race? Are we talking about ethnicity? Are we talking about religion, right? Thinking about the religious diversity that should be present in our organizations. Are we thinking about political orientation, marital status? So when we're talking about diversity, we really are talking about diversity in all of its forms and recognizing that from a sociological perspective, each and every one of us shows up in multiple ways. So sitting here in this space with you, I'm showing up as an African-American. I'm showing up as an African-American woman. That's an intersectional identity. I'm also showing up as a Christian in American society. I'm also showing up as a married woman, as a woman with children. So I'm showing up as a middle-class American, right? I'm showing up as American and not someone who was born in another country. So these are all different identities that I'm bringing into a space. And this is what we mean by diversity. And so when we talk about companies embracing diversity and doing the work to make sure that diversity is part of their organizations, we're talking about bringing a variety of backgrounds and styles, perspectives, and values and beliefs, right? And we recognize them as an asset, and we want to make sure that all of that is there for us to interact with. This is a great visual that helps us think a little bit, again, more about the ways in which each and every one of us show up and what is present in our workspaces. And so I want to pause and recognize that this may be a different model for some people, right? There may have been, perhaps in the past, this idea that when you show up in the workplace, you're a worker, right? And so there's just sort of one way in which you show up. And we sort of strip people of these identities and kind of say, none of this belongs in the workplace, or none of this is relevant for the workplace. And that's an antiquated model, right? What we're talking about in terms of embedding diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace is recognizing that none of us leave these identities at the door, right? When I come into the workplace, particularly maybe thinking about a pre-COVID-19 world where we could all physically be in the space, but when you come into a space, right, you don't leave these identities or check them at the door. They come in with you, and they are lenses or perspectives by which you understand the world, perspectives and lenses by which you engage and interact with other people. And they're important. They're important aspects of who we are. And so therefore, as we think about how we engage in conversation with one another, as we create policies to create equitable workspaces, these are identities that we need to be mindful of and recognize and also be knowledgeable of. And so that last part is an opportunity for us just in this moment to think about what are we knowledgeable of and why is it important if we're going to create diverse and equitable spaces, right? So recognizing the changing workforce and again, the diversity that's embedded within our larger society, right? We might as a society be aware of racial and ethnic differences, right? And race and ethnicity are different concepts, right? Race is a social construct. So we do talk about race in terms of, you know, again, African-American or Black, white, Latino or Hispanic, which actually is not race, it's actually ethnicity because it's culture. But we as an American society talk about that as a racial identity. So those are things that we might be familiar with, right? In part because of the society in which we live and because of those identities being prevalent in ways in which we've talked about inequality throughout our society. But it's also important for us to recognize that people in our workforce are showing up and have, you know, different perspectives based on their age, right? So someone who is a baby boomer or someone who is Generation X or Z or a millennial, right? As a result of being born and socialized at a different time period, is going to have a different perspective and way of looking at the world that needs to be understood. If we're thinking about individuals and how they show up in terms of their sex, right? We need to begin to understand that sex, and the way that we've talked about that has been in terms of thinking about biological assignment at birth, whether someone is assigned female or male, or again, 1.4% of the world's population is actually born intersex, right? So we move beyond this binary of male versus female. That is different than thinking about the ways in which we understand gender identity and gender expression, right? And so understanding that sex is not gender identity and gender expression, and that those are different concepts, then gives us the space and the knowledge to begin to create a work environment that is going to be equitable and friendly for individuals who are transgender. So for transgender women and transgender men in the workforce, right? Again, being able to create a workspace that is equitable for everyone, for those individuals in particular, means that we've got to perhaps do some deep knowledge and some deep work to understand, well, what is the difference between sex, gender identity, and expression, and how does that then impact the workplace? So this wheel is here designed to help us, again, think about all these identities and how they show up in the workplace and how they filter in and help us better understand the individuals that we're working with, as well as from an institutional perspective, the ways in which we might begin to then think about building a workspace that, again, acknowledges the richness and the diversity of the people that are in our workspace. At this time, I'll take a pause and see if there are any questions, particularly any questions about some of these identities on the wheel. So this is, again, designed to be an educational opportunity. So this is a space perhaps in which we could be brave. If you have questions or need further clarifications for some of the identities that you see, these are things that we could definitely have conversation about. I will note here on the wheel where it talks about, particularly in the outer wheel, you'll see a red block here that says role at CCU. Obviously, this is something I use quite a bit at the place where I work, but that would be role at one's facility or company or organization, right? So again, someone who serves in the C-suite, or someone who is an organizational leader, perhaps a VP, in part just because of the role that they play, they're going to have a different vision and perspective, a different lens than someone perhaps who has a different type of role. So it's just yet another way for us to think about, even within our own organizations, structurally, the positions that we hold can lead us to have different identities and different lenses or ways of looking at the world. So it looks like there is a question. Okay, can I explain a little bit about physical appearance? Absolutely. So physical appearance is going to be important, right? Because physically we're all different. And one thing that's going to be important in terms of thinking about these identities and the way that they perhaps show up in our society is that oftentimes certain identities are normed. And so in terms of physical appearance, one thing that if we're doing some deep work, we may recognize we norm certain physical attributes as standard or as ideal. So, you know, again, depending on the company in which you work with, and your company may have nothing to do with, you know, sort of kind of visual representations of beauty, but just think about the ways in which our own ideas of physical beauty may then, for example, impact the way in which we view people. So an example, if a norm in our society is that to be healthy means to be tall and thin, right? We might unintentionally then be thinking that people who are we deem overweight or people who are not tall, we might find them actually suspect, or we might not attribute to them certain value or believe that they are as capable or as, you know, as acceptable as others because of an ingrained norm that we have. So physical appearance, again, really does help us think about the ways in which we may unconsciously be thinking about certain physical attributes being more desirable and perhaps indicators of success more so than others. So again, we do want physical appearance, we want diversity in terms of physicality in our workspace, right? So no workspace should be, for example, you know, trying to hire everyone who's blonde, right? Like no one in the workspace, not everyone should be blonde, right? So even something like that, which again, some studies have suggested based on our own sort of implicit biases, when it comes to hiring, for example, we could be creating a workforce that looks oddly similar. And it could be oddly similar, not just in terms of race or in terms of sex, but also maybe in something in terms of physical appearance. Great question. Any other questions? Share a definition of gender identity and expression. Absolutely. So when we think about gender identity and expression, ultimately what we're talking about is the ways in which people view themselves, right? So where sex is our biological sex, right? What your assignment at birth, male, female, or intersex, gender identity expression is really about the ways in which you perceive from a psychological perspective, the way you see your gender. And one thing we have to think about is that gender is socially constructed, right? And that might be hard to sort of take in, but think about this. Gender is socially constructed, right? This idea of the behaviors and the attitudes and the ways in which we perform gender. We might, you know, one perspective might be that, of course, women are supposed to walk a certain way, or women are supposed to wear their clothes a certain way, right? And we might, again, say that's tied to sex. What we're saying here in terms of gender identity and expression is really recognizing that that is a social construct and it's something that we've created and designed as a society. But ultimately, there are individuals in our society who perhaps maybe at birth were born a particular sex, but the way in which they see themselves and the way in which they perform gender does not align with their biological sex. And these individuals in our society are what we call transgender. An example, again, going back to thinking about gender identity and gender expression, one that I like to share is that for a very long time in our society, to be a woman, right, to perform womanhood, right, to express one's gender was to have long hair, right? Women had to have long hair. And if you didn't have long hair, that meant that somehow you weren't a woman, right? Somehow you weren't feminine. Again, women, you know, to wear pants, that again was a sign that someone was not a woman, right? And so when we talk about gender being socially constructed, that is a way for us to then begin to think about how gender identity and expression really sort of play itself out in our society and how they really are distinct concepts from sex. So this becomes important, right? Because if we're thinking about our changing society and changing in the sense that, let me be clear, we are becoming more inclusive and open, not to say that this is not always been a part of our society, but if we think about the ways in which as an inclusive workforce, if we want to honor and respect the identities of individuals, particularly maybe thinking of someone who is a transgender woman or transgender man, we then have to begin to think about how they are showing up in the workspace and how that may ultimately, if we're being honest, challenge some of our assumptions about the connections between sex and gender identity and expression. And then also in terms of policies and practices, what kind of climate and environment are we creating that would allow them and create a space for them to be their genuine selves in our workspace? Any other questions? Okay, so some of these attributes are discernible during an interview process, but such as religious may not be, given that companies can attributes or target in these attributes. What are some tactical things that companies can do during the hiring process to attract and hire in all dimensions of this wheel? This is a great question, and we'll dive more into this. But we will talk about what does it mean to engage in active recruiting, right? So yes, what I'm not proposing is that as you're hiring people, you ask them to share these things about themselves, right? Again, in some case, in some context with regards to the law, we're not allowed to ask that, right? But if we are being proactive and intentional, what we can do is we can proactively think about where do we put our job ads, right? What kind of language are we using in our job ads? Are we creating an environment through even in advertising the position where we openly talk about welcoming all people regardless of their identities? So I think, again, we'll talk more about this a little bit later in this presentation as we move deeper into some of the tactics and strategies that one can use. But we do want to be proactive, again, in signaling in all the ways that we can that when we're talking about diversity, that we're talking about it in ways which for many of us may be obvious, right? What is overt, but also perhaps ways in which, again, according to this wheel, some things are less overt. We still welcome that, and we are looking for that diversity as well. Has there been any discussion about generational diversity? Yes. And so again, if we look at the wheel where generational diversity, we're going to be talking about, we can think about age, right? How that shows up within the workspace. In fact, it's part of our series, our next series, and I don't have the date off the top of my head, but it is in this presentation, so you'll know that before you leave. Our next series, or our next presentation, excuse me, in this series focuses on generations at work and gives us an opportunity to dive deeper to talk about the generational differences in the workspace and how do we create an environment that accommodates and that celebrates that generational difference. But yes, it's going to be very important for us as something to think about. Just now, I know something that I'm struggling with and working with in the workspace, right, is the ways in which millennials in particular may think differently about how to engage in deliberation in the workspace, right? Some of us perhaps, not just based on our age, but also as a result of other identities, maybe have a much more hierarchical understanding of how to engage in the workplace, where perhaps those individuals, millennials in particular, the way in which they have been socialized in our society, they may challenge this idea of a more hierarchical structure and welcome and invite and actually thrive more on a more participatory structure with regard to decision making in the workspace. So again, these are some of the things that we would have to think about and be able to recognize that are important in our workspace as we recognize that lots of different people who have different lived experiences are coming to the workplace. Awesome. Any other questions? Okay. So I think I've answered the questions. I'll see if there's anything else. And again, please feel free, if you want to unmute yourself, you're welcome to do that, but I also see the questions coming in through the screen, and so I'll answer them as much as I can. So what I'm going to do now is move on. We've spent a little bit of time here on diversity. Now I want to move to our next definition, our next concept, right? Equity. Equity at its core, as you can see here on the slide, really is about access. Right? So if we're doing the work to make sure that in our spaces, in our companies, in our organizations, we see the diversity in our society, we see that in our workspace, we then have to move farther, right? We have to move past just making sure that lots of different people are present. We do have to do that deep work then to think about how do we create a space that is accessible for all? How do we create a space where everyone can thrive? So you see here, equity is the promotion of policies and practices that gives members of our community what they need to have the opportunity to be successful, right? And so again, if we're thinking about, I'll use the example we just cited before, if we're thinking about creating a workspace that is truly welcoming and inclusive for transgender members of our community, right? Then we're going to need to be thinking about what are some of the policies that we've implemented at our institution, Some of those policies can be simply in terms of some of our HR policies. What are we promoting in terms of behavior, whether it be sort of microaggressions or outright discriminatory behavior in the workplace? Are we being clear about what is acceptable and what is not acceptable in our workspace? But also in terms of policies and policies in terms of thinking about creating an equitable workspace. What are we doing in terms of restroom facilities, right? If we have a space that only has restroom facilities that is just designated male or female, what signals are we sending? And also, if we're moving in that direction, which again is one direction that we could potentially move in, then are we as a community understanding the implications of that, right? Because what the law says, particularly if you have gender identity and expression in your non-discrimination statement, what that says is that individuals can use restrooms or take advantage of amenities based on their gender identity. So from a practice standpoint, if you have, for example, a transgender woman working in your workspace or in your office, right, that means a transgender woman is going to be using the women's facility. And so if we're understanding of that, then what behaviors should we expect in the workplace? How should people be responding to that? So this is what equity is really focused on. Equity means we've got to have an intentional focus on inclusion at all levels, right? Thinking this through, thinking about once we have and do that deep work, as we should be, of creating a space where all people are present, what kind of policies and practices do we have to make sure that everyone can successfully thrive and exist in this space? And then finally, that leads us to inclusion, right? And so equity and inclusion are partners. If we're talking about doing the work of equity, right, making sure that everyone has access, then ultimately what we're doing is we're transforming the culture and the climate in the places where we work, right? So we're actively and intentionally, again, sending signals that difference is welcomed, different perspectives are respectfully heard, and we want everyone to feel a sense of belonging, right? That our company, our organization is their home. They are part of our family, and they are valued here. They are respected here, and they are given the same opportunities to be able to thrive and grow. So we're really, again, talking about this idea of being proactive and intentional and really creating these opportunities, and not just creating, but also sustaining opportunities for people to be able to engage and connect and be part of our communities. So here's just a little bit more information about the business value of diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And these are from several studies, but I just wanted to share this information with you. You can see here, a diverse workforce drives economic growth, right? One way in which a scholar, I took this language from the scholar, literally says that it brings in the cash, right? So again, if we're thinking about your business and wanting your businesses to be profitable, we do know from various studies that inclusivity increases revenue. And that makes sense, right? Just think about the changing world in which we live, right? The ways in which there's a social demand in our society for people to be viewed holistically, seen for who they are, and valued by not just individuals, but also companies for who they are. So inclusivity absolutely includes revenue. We also know that a diverse workforce can capture a greater share of the consumer market, right? If we're thinking about inclusivity increasing revenue, what we know is that if you have a diverse workspace, right, it actually gives you an opportunity to then target a larger group of customers. It gives you in that workspace different voices and perspectives to then be able to think about how to reach out and send targeted messages, messages of value to people in those demographic groups, right? So think about it from this perspective. As someone who right now is abled, right? And there's a philosophy that says at some point we will all have some form of physical disability, right? So there's a notion that right now I could say that I am temporarily fully abled, but at some point, again, just thinking about the aging process, we might be differently abled. But if I do not have a cognitive impairment, or if I do not have a physical disability, i.e. I use a wheelchair, my lived experience right now is not going to give me a lot of information on how to be able to from a marketing perspective, perhaps speak to individuals who live through the world, right, with that particular lived experience and lens. And so not having someone as part of my diverse workforce who has educational experience as well as lived experience to be able to speak to the challenges and the needs of those communities, I miss out on an opportunity to be able to effectively market my product or my product to those individuals. So again, capturing having a diverse workforce gives us an opportunity to speak more and to speak genuinely to all people in our society. We can also see here that recruiting from a diverse pool of candidates means a more qualified workforce. So again, there are studies that absolutely show that when you're intentional about creating a more diverse workforce, because again, people are bringing different knowledge and expertise, you'll actually end up with a more qualified workforce. So when we are actually doing the work of being inclusive, we actually increase qualification or the quality of our work pool. And also we see here that diversity fosters a more creative and innovative workforce, right? Which I've just sort of alluded to, right? Again, different perspective, different lenses, it gives us an opportunity to think differently about something, which then again fosters more creativity, innovation, and allows us to speak differently to our consumers and to various markets. Diversity is important, and we're also recognize that when organizations are actively working to transform their culture, right? So when we're moving beyond diversity and having a diverse workforce, when we're actually, again, thinking about policies and practices to create a workforce where those employees feel proud and feel a sense of belonging in the place where they work, we also know that that is important for companies as well. And as you can see here, it positions them to achieve better and longer and stronger customer loyalty, as well as boost employee engagement and productivity, right? So we want the people who work in our companies and organizations to feel good about the places where they work, right? And just think about your own lived experience. There are, you know, if you're on Facebook, there are always these memes out there, but there's one meme that says, right, you know, if a person feels a sense of gratitude and a sense of belonging, they will do more, right, and give more than someone who doesn't feel that way. And so that's very much applicable in the workplace, right? And so we see here from various studies, employees who feel like their voices are heard at work are 5 times more likely to feel empowered, right, to do their best work, right? They feel a stake, they feel connected, so they want to do their best work. Employees who say that their companies provide equal opportunities are 4 times more likely to say that they're proud to work for their companies, right? From a retention standpoint, it's really important to make sure that we don't have constant turnover, right? Because again, that's not necessarily profitable in terms of thinking about how to always bring people in, but also the knowledge, right? The institutional knowledge and memory that leaves when people are constantly moving in and out can be problematic. So we really do want to be thinking about how are we, from an infrastructure standpoint, creating an environment where people are proud to work at their company so they're more likely to stay. And finally, we can see here that employees that say that they're able to be their authentic selves at work are 3 times more likely to say that they're proud to work for that company and they feel empowered to perform their best work, right? So we want people to show up authentically. We want them to be able to be their full selves. One way to think about it is to not feel like they have to wear a mask or to hide who they are, to do their best work. And again, that profits not just the people within the company, but it profits companies holistically. So a couple things that we can think about, and this touches on one of the questions that we had earlier, right? Building diversity in the workplace. From a recruitment and hiring standpoint, here are some things that we want to think about, and we're going to talk about them. I want to be explicit. We're going to talk about them fairly briefly today, because as part of our series builds on the ways in which companies can move forward. And our last session in this series focuses, as you can see here, the asterisk on DEI strategic planning. And so in our last session, particularly in this series in December, we're going to spend the entire time talking about how organizations can dive deep into strategic planning, and on these various factors begin to think about how to develop a strategic plan for their organization to be able to embed DEI into what they do. But it's important for us as we start the series to mention this and to let you all know these are some of the things that you should be thinking about as central parts of your toolkit. And so with regard to recruitment and hiring, it's really going to be important to do these 6 things. Leverage diverse job boards. So again, if we're thinking about wanting to do the deep work to make sure that we have as much diversity in our workforce as possible, we'll want to think proactively and strategically about where are we placing job ads, right? So if you're someone who just says, oh, I'm looking for someone in the workforce, I'm going to place a job in the Sun News, and that's the only place you think you place it, then you know that you're limiting your potential on reaching out to a diverse workforce. I'll use my profession as an example just to better help us think this through. As a political scientist, I know that if I want to hire political scientists for a university, I am going to place a job ad in the American Political Science Association job board. That's where an ad needs to go, because most political scientists in America, as well as the world, are members of that organization. But I also know historically the way in which political science as a profession has not always been inclusive. I do know that if I want to target African-American political scientists, Latino and Latina political scientists, political scientists who are part of the LGBTQ+ community, I'm also going to have to reach out to those various caucuses. And in those caucuses, they have specific job boards where they can also advertise jobs as well. So I'm going to be proactive and not just have my job ad in one place, but I'm going to recognize that within my profession, there are also perhaps affinity groups. There are also specific job boards that cater to individuals with various identities. And I want to make sure that I'm putting advertisements in those places as well. Again, some of these are going to work for your workplace, some of them are not, right? Depending on the organizational structure that you have, the resources that you have. But one highly suggested tip that does work for various organizations is to offer targeted internships and scholarships. And so this is about the idea of sort of building a pipeline. So if you have the opportunity, one way in which you can diversify your workforce is to give people who perhaps are maybe still in an educational context, give them an opportunity to intern or learn more about the place in which you work. And then they're developing job skills and already then building a sense of community in the space in which you work. And then when a position opens up, you're able to offer that position to that individual. So that has become yet another important way, particularly through targeted internships and scholarships, to be able to identify individuals and bring them into the organization. Again, you'll want to highlight diversity on your career site. And so something to think strategically about is, as an organization, do you have a DEI statement, right? So, you know, by law, and many organizations do, you know, they'll have some statement that, you know, sort of says to the extent, you know, we don't discriminate, right? That's sort of standard. That's kind of the, you know, the floor. It's what's required. Right? But again, if we want to be engaged in proactive signaling and being intentional about really cultivating and creating an inclusive workspace, we'll want to figure out what are the ways in which we can actually highlight diversity. Highlight it and also signal the ways in which we truly are working to be a place that not only values diversity, but also values inclusion and values equity. So we'll want to be thinking strategically about that, not just on our websites and on our career sites, but just also embedded in all of our information that we send out. How are we sending this signal to those who might see anything about our company? They know that this is a core value that we have. With regard to recruitment and hiring, one thing you can also do is explicitly ask for referrals. Right? And so as you're working with various people in various companies, to make it clear that, you know, we are a company and organization that is looking to diversify. And so based on your knowledge of individuals who are working in this industry, please let them know about this job opportunity that we have. This is something we do quite a bit, I would say, in my profession in higher education, but I know that speaking with chief diversity officers at various companies like Google and Pizza Hut and other companies, you know, this is important, right? Asking explicitly for referrals as you're connecting with people and letting people know about opportunities in your company, being explicit and asking for them to send people to your job sites and to let them know that people should be specifically looking for information about this opportunity. It's also going to be important to then recognize the value of having a diverse interview panel. And again, this might differ based on how your company or organization is structured. So perhaps maybe you don't have a panel, perhaps maybe you just have a hiring manager and it's one person who does this. I would say from a scientific standpoint, that's something to consider. So most studies show that when you have more than one person as part of the hiring process, that does it increases the likelihood of having more diverse people be part of the applicant pool and then move through the applicant process. But embedded in this, at the core of this, which is also then connected to number 6 as well, is you want to make sure that you have different people with different perspectives who are part of the hiring process. Because if we don't, what could happen is that our implicit bias or our unconscious bias can play a part in terms of how we hire and then who is part of our company. So perhaps you've all heard of the resume study. The resume study is something that has been done and replicated since 2008. But the resume study at its core is basically a study that shows that based on our own implicit biases and our own preconceived notions about which identities or which identity groups are likely to be successful in the workplace, we can use that information to make decisions with regard to hiring. And so one of the resume studies, for example, shows that you can have 2 exact resumes. The information, the schooling, the level of expertise and experience are the exact same. But the only difference in the resume would be resume A is from a person that has a quote unquote American sounding name, which again, diving deeper into that may be a name that sounds perhaps maybe even more white, right? So like a Sam Jones, right? Samantha Jones or Sam Jones. Another resume B, same information, but maybe perhaps that resume is from Rashad Smith, right? Or Shanika Jones, right? And what we see based on those studies, those controlled studies, is that individuals with the quote unquote American sounding name, or in some context, the white sounding name, is anywhere from 4 to 5 times more likely to receive an interview and then get the job, right? So this is the kind of thing that we want to be mindful of and recognize that this does play a role in recruitment and hiring, right? And so if we're sitting around wondering, why isn't our workforce diverse? Why isn't our workforce diverse? Why don't we see diversity here? The questions we might have to ask ourselves, particularly with regard to hiring, is how are we hiring? How are our implicit biases factoring into the hiring process? We also then want to think about embedding equity inclusion into the workplace, right? So it's not just about recruitment, but it's also about retention. And retention allows us to focus on our policies and our practices. And as I mentioned before, in our series, particularly when we get to our session on DEI strategic planning, we'll dive deep into these factors for each individual participant to be able to really help them start to develop their diversity, equity, and inclusion strategic plan. But generally speaking, when we're thinking about embedding equity and inclusion in the workplace, we want to think about what are some of the policies in our workplace, right? So we want to create diversity-friendly policies, or we want to create equitable policies or inclusive policies, right? So I gave the example of someone who's transgendered. Again, thinking about what are the policies in place to make sure that we're creating an equitable space for our transgender employees. What are the policies that are in place that make sure that we're creating a place for an equitable space for our for other employees, again, for maybe elderly employees, for employees, perhaps if we're using marital status as a lens, recognizing again from a sociological perspective in our country that women are disproportionately the caregivers of children, right? Do we unintentionally have policies that make it difficult for women in the workforce with children to be able to be successful and included in the workspace, right? So these are the kinds of things that we want to be asking ourselves. And oftentimes, let's just be clear, our intent is not to discriminate, or our intent is not to make it difficult for various people to be successful in the workplace. But we might be just drawing on a policy that we think is standard or neutral, and it's not, right? So we have to do some interrogation to understand, where did this policy come from? When it was created, whom did it benefit? What did the world look like? And now, understanding our desire to create an inclusive workspace, does that policy still work? Some other things here, just briefly, we'll want to reassess employee benefits, right? Again, so we'll want to recognize that there is the floor of things that we can do, right? And we'll want to, again, recognize that companies do want to maximize their profits, but we'll also want to be thinking about, in terms of creating a workspace that is inclusive and also that fosters retention, what are some of the benefits that we're providing to our employees? And again, how are we designing benefit packages that may unintentionally be exclusive or problematic for individuals who might not have been present in our workspace before? We'll also want to make sure that we have diversity training, right? So what you are doing right now in terms of making sure that you are increasing your cultural competency and thinking more deeply about how to engage with people, different people, frankly, in the workplace, that is something we'll want to normalize and make standard as part of our organizations, right? So it's not an add-on to our work, it's not something different or something special, but it's part of the work that we do to be proficient and to be good community members within our own organizations. We're constantly working to increase our cultural competency. Other things we can do, we can establish mentorships, right? So recognizing that through partnership and mentorships, that might be a way to increase retention, creating opportunities for people with shared background and identities to be able to connect with each other in the workplace and provide mentorship. And again, that's going to vary depending on the size of your organization and company. But again, this is a proven technique to make sure that we're embedding equity and inclusion in the workspace. Build diverse teams, right? So even in the context of thinking about what you do, particularly if you're using a partner or team model in the workspace, making sure that those teams are diverse across many vectors of identity. And then also measuring your efforts, right? And this is going to be a key part of developing a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategic plan, right? So if I say that I want to make sure that I'm creating an environment where all of my employees feel welcomed and valued and heard, I'm going to need to measure that. One standard way that we often measure that in the workplace is to consistently have climate surveys, right? Where the people in our workspace have the opportunity to confidentially, or maybe through an anonymous mechanism, share their perspectives about the workplace, so that those who are in leadership know what's working and what's not, and what are some of the things that can be improved upon, again, to create an equitable and inclusive workspace. So what I want to do with the time that we have left is to talk a little bit more about, particularly at the individual level, how we begin to do some of this work, right? So the last two slides have really given us some ideas, some things to put in our institutional or organizational tool belt to begin to think about how to create a diverse and equitable workplace and to embed this in our institutions. But we also want to think about this at an individual level. There's a question here. It says, can you restate the questions to consider regarding creating diversity-friendly policies? Yes, so again, when thinking about creating diversity-friendly policies, you'll want to think about where did this policy come from? You know, where did it originate, right? When was it created? When it was created, what was the purpose of creating this policy? Now that we recognize that we have a diverse workforce, we can ask ourselves, who does this policy benefit and who does it hurt? And then if we recognize through our investigation, through our deep sort of work that, and our deep look inward, that this policy isn't friendly to all, what are we willing to change in the policy? What are we willing to add in the policy? So an example I'll give you that's not necessarily workforce related, but it does come to mind, and I do teach it quite a bit in one of my classes that I teach, is this idea of thinking about in the law profession in particular. This idea that to be a successful lawyer, one must work 80 hours a week. This seems standard, right? And this is something that, you know, that's still sort of pervasive in the law profession, right? That to be a successful attorney, one must work 80 hours a week and must be in the workplace 80 hours a week. So you have to show up and be in the workspace in a particular way, right? If we do some deep investigation, right, willing to do some deep dive and kind of peel away the layers of the onion, we might ask ourselves, when that was created and when that norm, and to be clear, sometimes policies are just norms too. When that norm or that expectation or policy was created, what did the workforce look like? Well, in the case of being an attorney and practicing law, that's when men were primarily practicing law, right? And women, again, from a societal standpoint, were designated as, you know, the workplace was their home, right? So women were not in the profession. Right? And so as the profession changes, and what we know now is that, again, looking at statistics, there are more women in law school than men, right? As the profession changes and as the profession becomes more inclusive, we have to ask ourselves, well, where did this standard come from? And if this standard is not inclusive, if this standard practice or policy is not inclusive and has, you know, been created to sort of sustain a particular way of thinking about gendered work, how do we dismantle that? And if I'm a law firm, I'm then going to be thinking about how do I dismantle that within my own law organization, within my own firm, my own company, right? So now I might be thinking about more family-friendly policies, right? I might be thinking differently about the distribution of work and how that is distributed among partners. I might be thinking differently about the criteria that I use to determine whether one becomes a partner or not, right? So it's this type of thinking that gives us the opportunity to really, again, interrogate what is it that we have? Is it useful? Is it beneficial for our workforce? And if it's not, what are we willing to create? What are we open to creating? Another question has come in. Oh, sorry. Okay. All right. So I think that question was answered. Great. So we will move on. So, as I was sharing before, again, it's an institutional lens, and it's a really important lens for us to be thinking about. But I also want to recognize, as institutions can't do that kind of thinking, right? They can't do that kind of transformative thinking and evaluation, which is very much connected to equity and inclusion. They can't do that as if we as individuals aren't in a position to do that for ourselves. Right? So as you can see here in the slide, it says valuing individual and group cultural difference is critical to creating an inclusive workplace. We are part of the workplace, and in some cases, many of us here are here as representatives for various organizations that we work for, meaning that we are in those decision-making spaces or in those places where decisions are happening, right? We play a central role in that. So in order for the institution to change, the organization or company to change, and to be able to create a diverse and inclusive workspace, that means as individuals who represent the company and work for the company, we have to position ourselves to be able to do that. So as you see here, it's going to be really important for each and every one of us as an individual to think about, how do I develop my cultural competence? Cultural competence, as you see here, is the ability to interact effectively with people from different cultures beyond the boundaries of my own cultural interpretations and biases, right? So I can't begin to think about what is it like to create an inclusive policy for workers of multiple generations in my workforce, or to create you know, an inclusive workspace for people across gender in my workspace, to create an inclusive workspace for people across racial and ethnic backgrounds in my workspace, if I'm not aware of the identities, right? So let's go back to the wheel. If I'm not aware of the differences in the identities, and also the differences in experience that people have had in our society as a result of those identities. Another way to think about this, and a more sort of specific way that shows up in the workspace, is that the way in which we engage with each other in the workspace and communicate within the workspace That is all filtered through our cultural perspectives and our identities, right? So the way in which we're going to engage with one another, the way in which we're going to talk with one another, the way in which we are going to come together and work communicatively with each other in the workspace is influenced by our perspectives, and our perspectives are influenced by our identities. And so you'll see here are many of the identities that are in the wheel. Again, they filter in. Here's one way I want us to begin to maybe sort of think about the ways in which our cultural competence is going to be important in building community in our workspace. So I'm not sure if you all can see it. I hope you can. On this slide, you're going to see on what is my right side an image. If you look at this image, and again, in a more interactive space, I could perhaps kind of chime in with you all to sort of get a sense of what you see. But in this image, often what people see, they see instinctively one of two things. They may instinctively see an older woman with a shawl around her shoulders, some stubble on her beard. She has maybe a rather large nose. They see 2 eyelashes, and they see, you know, the front of her hair, which is dark red, and then they see kind of this orange hair. And I do want to recognize that if anyone has a visual impairment, perhaps if you're colorblind, this might be more difficult to see. So I do want to acknowledge that and recognize that. But looking at this image, that's often what most people will see. They will see this older woman, and it's a side profile of an older woman. Other people instinctively, when they look at this image, they'll see a younger woman. They'll see a younger woman, perhaps maybe from the 1920s. That's kind of the cultural aesthetic they see. Again, she has a shawl around her shoulders. They see a side profile. They see a feather in her hair, perhaps signaling maybe sort of the roaring 20s. And so this is a visual that we use quite a bit in DEI training to help people begin to understand that 2 people can look at the same thing and see something very differently. And this is what happens as a result of our identities. We can look at the same thing and see something very differently. And in an effort to develop our cultural competency, we want to train ourselves to see all that is there. And we want to be able to see all that is there, particularly when we are engaging in decision-making, as well as engaging in simple discourse with one another. So with this visual here, again, what you want to do is to train yourself to be able to see both the older woman and the younger woman in this image. It takes training, it takes time, because instinctively, our eye is going to be drawn to one visual or the other. But our goal here is to recognize that with training, with a willingness to recognize that I perhaps have a particular way of seeing things, but it's not the only way of seeing things, we are going to be able to position ourselves to be able to look at something from multiple perspectives and then engage in the kind of decision making and problem solving that absolutely gives us an opportunity to be able to view things holistically and then engage in decision making. So what we want to do, as you can see here, is that we want to learn to be able to see and to hear from various perspectives. This is not about being politically correct, but it is about being respectful, responsive, and inclusive. Recognizing that we understand that based on our own lived experiences and our identities and lenses, we may show up with a particular perspective or bias, but it's not the only way to view or see something. So as you can see here, cultural competence is going to be really important because I mentioned before that our implicit bias plays a role in how we engage in decision making, and particularly for our desire to create an equitable and inclusive workspace, our implicit bias is going to influence what we do. And so we want to find ways to first recognize that we have implicit bias and then minimize that. So our next session, actually, in our series, after we talk about the series, after we talk about generations at work and really focus on generational differences, we're going to have an entire session that focuses on implicit bias. So this is just a taste to give you an idea of the ways in which it factors into our decision making and impacts our ability to create inclusive and equitable workspaces. But I thought it important to present this here today so we know all the tools that need to be in our toolbox. As you can see here, implicit bias refers to attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, our actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. These biases reside in our subconscious, and they can be activated without our awareness or our intentional control. And so this is why it's really important for us to, again, recognize that it's important for us to do the deep work to figure out what our biases are. Because oftentimes, as you can see here, we espouse that we might not even have implicit bias, but we do. We also need to recognize that this implicit bias can cause us to have attitudes or feelings about people based on the identity characteristics that we talked about in the context of the wheel, right? So as a society, we oftentimes espouse, again, to perhaps really value all people. We want to treat all people fairly. We don't see color. We don't see differences. But if we're being honest and realistic about the society in which we live and the messages perhaps which may have been unintentionally embedded in us, what we do know from the data and what we maybe even from a deep dive into our own lives will recognize is that we may have certain feelings and attitudes about people based on our identity characteristics that we act on when we don't want to, i.e. the resume studies, right? Again, if we're being generous, most people in terms of hiring are not saying, I want to hire this type of person over this type of person because I feel that this group of people are better than others. Most people are not doing that. Again, most people are coming from a place of, I just want to hire the best person, and I don't really, I don't care about, what they look like or who they are. I just want to hire the best person. But the data shows us that that's not what we're doing, right? Because again, we can have resumes, same exact credentials, but we see this in the context of gender as well as race. We're more likely to hire the individual who's part of the dominant group. In the context of race, hire the person whose name perhaps signals that they're white. In terms of gender, more likely to hire the person whose name signals that they're male, right? So clearly something is at work. Even if we espouse to really have egalitarian values, something is at work in our decision-making process. And we know that something to be at work is implicit bias. And so when we are diligent and willing and wanting to develop our cultural competence, that's when we can begin to see that we all have implicit bias and then minimize that. It's also important to recognize that implicit bias develops over the course of our lifetime, right? So again, all of us have it. It develops over the course of our lifetime, and it develops because we are constantly being exposed to messages, both direct and indirect, that send signals about people and how we are to interpret and understand people. So here's a few characteristics, again, some of which we've already gone over, that come directly from the Kieran Institute at Ohio State University. They've been doing a lot of research on implicit bias and how it factors into our decision-making process and its connection to cultural competence. But some things I think is important, again, for us to know. It's pervasive and everybody has it, right? So this isn't about, saying that certain people based on their identities have implicit bias and others don't. I always say, based on the trainings that I do, if you are human, if you have any cognitive ability at all, then you are primed to have implicit biases. You're primed to have them. So we have them, even if we avow commitments to impartiality, because we are social creatures, and also because of the research that we know cognitively of how our brains work and how our brains take in information, we're bound to have bias. So one example I like to share that might be helpful in helping us think this through, I will admit my own bias. I am not someone who spends quite a bit of time in nature, but I know that there are people who enjoy being outdoors. And if you're one of those people who enjoy being outdoors, particularly maybe walking through forest or a landscape, you may have heard of saying, leaves of 3, leave it be. That saying is often about poison ivy, right? So poison ivy has 3 leaves, and you want to, not engage with poison ivy. You want to stay away from poison ivy if you're out in the wilderness and enjoying the outdoors. That's a cognitive process right there. That saying is something that cognitively we can embed in our minds that helps us understand the world around us and helps us particularly to understand to stay away from poison ivy. So is it wrong to say leave the 3, leave it be when I'm talking about poison ivy? No, because that's what it was designed to talk about, right? But what we don't often do, and here's where our implicit bias shows up, are all leaves of 3 poison ivy? No. There are lots of other foliage out there that is not, it's not poison ivy, it also has 3 leaves. But our implicit bias will tell us leaves of 3, leave it be. That means anything that's a leave of 3 must be bad. But what we really mean is poison ivy is bad. But what I've done is I've just now said anything that's a leave of 3, I now need to be weary of. I need to be concerned about. I need to stay away from. And now I'm implicitly going to act on that without doing the deep interrogation and doing the deep work of trying to figure out, well, am I really talking about all leaves of 3 or am I just talking about poison ivy? Okay. We also want to know, as we can see here, that implicit associations don't align with our declared beliefs. So we've talked about that. We also can recognize that we hold implicit biases in favor of our own groups. Also, although the research can show that we hold implicit biases against our in-group, right? And so if we think particularly about Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, this is the case with Thurgood Marshall that dismantled separate but equal in the United States from an educational standpoint that then moved into employment and other vectors as well. One of the key factors in that case was Thurgood Marshall giving dolls to African-American children. And the African-American children in that case looking at the dolls and saying, oh, well, if you're asking me which doll is better, the white doll is better. So these are African-American children on the stand saying the white doll is better. And you're going, well, why? Because that doesn't seem right. You should favor your own in-group. But what's the message been about race, right? And again, we've done the work as a society to perhaps tear down that message, right? But what's been the implicit message with regard to racial superiority, that white is better? So here's a case embedded in that seminal case that we all learn about in school, right? That shows the ways in which implicit bias permeates. The good news is that implicit bias is malleable, right? And this is why we talk about at an individual level, if you're going to do any work within your company to begin to transform your company and embed DEI, we need to know at an individual level that we all have implicit bias. We all need to increase our cultural competency, but in order to increase our cultural competency, we have to know that we can change our biases. We have to know that this is malleable, that we can unlearn what we have learned, and we can be proactive and intentional about embedding this into our decision-making processes. So I want to spend a little time here helping us think this through, right? So we need to take some proactive and intentional steps at an individual level, but then also at an organizational level to increase and develop our cultural competency. So if you remember on the slide before when I talked about at an organizational level diversity training, right? That is one way from an organizational standpoint to develop and grow the cultural competency of your organization, as well as the people in your organization. Okay, so any good diversity training, any good training or opportunity to engage in education about how to create an inclusive and equitable workforce is going to have information about implicit bias. And that's one of the reasons why we're going to have a whole session on that. We're going to spend an hour and a half talking deeply about implicit bias at both an organizational and institutional level. What I want to share with you today, again, just to have in your toolkit to get you prepared for those sessions, is to think about the fact that we need to come from a place of cultural humility and recognize that we all have bias. Every single person has bias. One tool that I suggest for everyone is Harvard University has a project called Project Implicit, and it's a great tool. It's private, it's anonymous, you're not sharing this information with anyone. But if you think about the identity wheel that we started with, and you think about all those different vectors of identity, on their website, they have tests with about 17 different identity forms or vectors of identity. And you can take these sort of quick, rapid tests that let you know what your own implicit bias is. And you'll get a sense of the degree to which the language that they use, the degree to which you may favor certain identities over others. And what's so interesting about this particular project and what's so impactful about it is that at this point, I think they've had more than 11 million people take these different tests. Which as a social scientist is a great data point, right? 11 million people engaged in some form of research, you are able to really talk wildly about the generalizability, right? And what they found from those more than 11 million people is that 99.999% of people have some form of bias, right? So again, it gets us to a point to recognize that this is something that we all have as a result of being social creatures. And once we recognize we have it, we've got to do some important and intentional work to figure out how to minimize it. So taking the test and taking those tests across multiple vectors is going to be one place to start. Another places to start are some of these cognitive exercises that I'll just mention really quickly here. One of them is just kind of this idea of taking a flashlight and kind of looking at yourself, right? So really being intentional and thinking about your internal thoughts and feelings. And before you act instinctively, ask yourself, why am I thinking this? What's driving me to make this decision? What's driving me to think this way? Should I be thinking this way? Right? So that's just one cognitive process that allows us to slow down and ask these questions before we move on. Question here, have you seen any differences by age in the way in which people see themselves and their biases? That is a great question. There are some studies that do show that there are some differences in terms of age, but then there are also other studies that show, unfortunately, no. Right? So particularly if we think about in the context of, I'll use, for example, race, there were those studies who would argue, okay, generationally speaking, especially thinking about the work that we've done as a society, right? Thinking about us, quote unquote, being post-racial, right? We would think that older Americans have more bias, right? And are more likely to favor whites over those who are non-white, right? So there's more of a bias towards kind of white identity. And younger people are less disposed to have that, right? We would see lower levels of bias in them as a result of kind of these generational shifts and changes. The data doesn't show that, right? The data doesn't always sort of show that. The data actually sort of shows that in some cases, in part because of our inability as a society to talk about and celebrate differences, we actually might see an increase in bias among younger people. And so yes, there are some studies that do focus on differences that we might see in generation, but again, ultimately across the board, based on the messages that we're receiving from the people who are part of our inner circle, as well as the external messages that we receive from media, as well as organizations and societies that we're part of, some of these messages are enduring and don't change regardless of moving through different generations that have perhaps been exposed to fundamental changes that one might think would lower that bias. Great question. The other thing that I want to talk about really quickly in terms of thinking about the ways in which we might lower implicit bias, these are just two sort of quick cognitive things that are going to be in your toolkit. Paying attention to those things about people that are different from ourselves that surprise you or make you feel uncomfortable. So I use this example quite a bit that resonates on my campus because people are aware of sort of the context. But I always sort of talk a little bit about how we have one high-ranking official on our campus or administrator who happens to be an African-American male and is very well liked, and people generally enjoy being in the space with him, right? And really enjoy kind of almost, you know, intentionally wanting to spend time with him. And so I use an example where I say, think about that person, right? Now, here's an example in which that same person who gravitates toward him, right? And wants to spend time with him, may also be the same person that if they don't recognize him on campus late at night and they get into an elevator and all they see is the African-American male, not name of the person who is an African-American male, their first instinct may be to not get on the elevator or to move over in the elevator. Right? So that is a way in which, again, using that example, and you can think about that in your own lived experience, right? The ways in which you have to sort of ask yourselves, why did I just do that? Why did I engage in that action? Why did I think that? Right? So if I see someone who is wearing a particular hairstyle or a particular type of clothing, and I instinctually think, oh, they're not going to be a good fit for our company. They're not going to be smart. They're not going to, why am I thinking this? Where is this coming from, right? Because that's the bias that is unintentional and also instinctive, right? It's happening without us sort of interrogating, where does this come from? Why am I thinking this? Where did I get this from? And is this true? Is this factual, right? So you can see, you can ask yourself, do I have automatic judgments about this person or this group of people? We also want to practice constructive uncertainty. And so this is going to be very important when making decisions, right? And particularly we can see this in the context of hiring and recruitment, right? But we also want to sort of think about the complexity of interactions and ask ourselves, you know, why am I pulled in this way? Like particularly when decision making, and I do this quite a bit with my team that I work with, you know, if I'm pulled to be right, why do I feel like I'm right? What am I missing? You know, what I'm working with a particular lens, but if I step outside of my lens and see this from a different perspective, would I still be pulled in this direction, right? So again, it becomes really important to take a moment and ask ourselves these kinds of questions. So what I want to do now is I want to show you a couple of videos of what happens in the workplace when we don't increase our cultural competence. And again, these are going to be things that we think about happen at an individual level, and we're going to be talking a little bit about microaggressions, which again, you're going to spend in our series quite a bit of time talking about microaggressions. So this is an opportunity for me just to quickly sort of present this to you and give you some insights. But I'm going to switch gears. I'm going to move out of this particular screen, and I want to show you two videos that give you an idea of the ways in which microaggressions, as you can see defined here, how they show up in the workplace and why they are detrimental in terms of trying to create an inclusive and equitable workspace. Okay, so here's the first video. Please let me know if you're unable to see this. Again, I'm working and learning all the tools and tricks and techniques within Zoom. So if you had any trouble seeing this, please let me know, or any trouble hearing it, please let me know.
Hi, Joe. Sorry I'm late for the call. I had a perfect morning, had to catch the last set.
You surf?
Yeah, I'm at Ocean Beach pretty much all the time. You?
Totally. We'll have to go when I'm up there next week.
Hey, I'm stoked. Epic.
Sure, 27 to 3 o'clock. Sounds good.
Are you John?
Joe? Oh, yeah. Great to meet you. I totally had you pictured different in my head.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but, anyways, can I get you a cup of coffee?
Yeah, sure.
My hair looks crazy. It looks like a mess.
I don't believe it. Your hair always looks awesome. I mean, how do you do it? Do you twist it? Do you do it yourself?
Yeah, I twist it myself.
Oh. I mean, do you mind?
Oh. Yeah, actually, I do mind.
Oh, sorry.
But I mean, if you're really curious about it, there are like tons of YouTube videos out now about natural hair, so maybe check that out.
There's no way we were gonna make it to that date.
No. I have no idea what they were thinking. What are you doing this weekend?
Going to the beach with some buddies.
Dude, sunscreen. You've already got quite the tan. Where's your family from?
Here.
Yeah, but before here, where are they from?
Still here.
But before that?
A few generations from here.
Cool. Sorry.
Okay.
Hi, Joe. Sorry I'm late for the call. I had a perfect...
So as I stop sharing and go back to the other screen, there are some questions that have come up. So I'm going to go to the chat. Okay. Yes. Thank you. Okay. Awesome. Okay. I heard the term microaggressions yesterday on the news for the first time, something to do with the going ons at Ellen DeGeneres' show. Thank you for explaining it. Yes. Yes, so this is, again, yet another way in which we are definitely finding and learning how this interrupts the workspace, right? And so if I get back to the shared screen, I want you to be able to see, of course it took me away from the screen that I want to go. I want you to see Gerald Wing Sue's definition of microaggressions. And as you can see here, they are the everyday verbal, nonverbal, and environmental slights, snubs, or insults, intentional or unintentional, which communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to target persons solely based on their marginal group membership. And this becomes really important, right? Because again, we just talked about, in terms of our implicit bias, a lot of this is unintentional. A lot of this is unconscious. And we also do know in the workspace, right, that particularly with regard to retention and creating an equitable and inclusive workspace, our communication and interaction with one another is going to be extremely important. And so, yes, if you use the Ellen DeGeneres show as an example, that is one way in which, you know, again, it's not the first time, but we're seeing in our society highlighted information about the ways in which we communicate with each other based on our implicit beliefs or assumptions about people based on their group identity, how that actually creates a very harmful work environment. I want to show you this other video, and it gives you an opportunity to see and learn a little bit more information about microaggressions.
Research tells us that the real reason most people leave an organization has nothing to do with pay. It has to do with their feeling of belonging. It has to do with how much they feel connected. And very often it's because they either feel disconnected or disrespected by their supervisor, or they feel disconnected within the organization. When these subtle messages occur, we call them micro messages and micro behaviors. The micro message are those subtle things that you say when you're interacting with others. It could be something like, hurry up, I don't have much time. Or you interrupt. Or you move quickly from that person speaking, trying to hurry to the next person. Those would be negative micro messages. We also call those microaggressions or micro inequities. Micro behaviors are those nonverbal things that you might do that also disconnect. Things such as looking at your watch when someone is speaking to you, or inviting someone in and getting them to start talking. Or imagine when you're at a meeting and someone is speaking, but you're looking at your notes and you're doing other things rather than actually paying attention to the person speaking. Particularly for individuals who are different from the majority in the organization, folks that we call diverse, even though everybody's diverse, particularly for them, those messages are loud and clear. Now, the good news is there is a solution if you're willing to practice. There's a technique that I call STOP. The S stands for state the behavior. The T stands for tell the person how you feel. The O stands for options, and the P stands for positive results. It only takes about 45 seconds when you practice it and when you do it well. You need to practice it though, because this is an emotional kind of feedback. So practice it and
Okay. I understand that you may not have been able to see the video. Is that correct? Sorry. So it switched to a Zoom screen and not the video. So sorry about that. Were you able to hear the video? So someone let me know if you were able to hear the video. Let's see. Yes. Okay. So you did hear the video. Great. Okay. Well, so we're batting 50 out of 100 there. Great. Okay. Because we are running out of time, I will not re-show the video. So hopefully, yes, you did hear it. And I will make these videos available as resources so you'll be able to reference them. But again, I think the video at its core was able to just provide more information about the ways in which microaggressions in particular are problematic in the workspace. And so as we're thinking about doing that deep work to create an equitable workspace, we want to think about how do we provide opportunities for people on our workspace to be able to address these and learn how better to move away from this. we are running out of time. And so again, I want to make sure I use my time wisely. So with the time that we have left, I just want to give you a quick scenario to help you sort of think a little bit about some of the things that we'll be working on through this series, and particularly how at an individual as well as an individual as well as organizational level, we might be thinking about how to address issues of microaggression and again, embed equity and inclusion in our workspace. So consider this: you have a new employee that has joined your organization and joined your company, and that employee has shared that their preferred pronouns are they, them, theirs. Now, let's take a moment, and for some of you, that might be a moment in which you say you actually have to, recognize the develop. Yes, the slides will be shared. You might recognize that you have to do your own work in terms of your cultural competency, because someone might be saying right now, well, what are preferred pronouns? Like, what does this mean? And again, if we understand the ways in which sex and gender identity and expression are distinct concepts, and therefore help us better understand the way in which transgender men and women move through our society, or perhaps even individuals who, in terms of their gender identity expression, find themselves to be non-binary, right? So in terms of their gender identity, they don't see themselves as fully male or fully female, or fully woman or fully man. We then understand that in order to be respectful of them in terms of their gender identities, rather than using she, her, and hers, or him, his, and his, we actually, in terms of talking about that individual, based on what they've asked here, may need to use the pronouns they, them, theirs, right? So this is an example of the ways in which diversifying our workspace, right, then leads us to do this deep work. Am I myself culturally competent? Do I understand, based on my knowledge of gender identity and expression, that I'm going to perhaps be encountered with someone asking me to use pronouns that may or may not feel familiar to me, right? And I want to give you the space to be able to say that, yes, that may not feel familiar, right? And so it may be a moment of learning and growth for you, and it may not feel familiar, but it's the work that we have to do. Then again, moving to the next piece in terms of our company and embedding equity and inclusion, we have to ask ourselves, not only am I consistently using these pronouns, but are others in the company going to consistently use those pronouns, right? So again, as you can see here, someone might honestly, and I think it's important to recognize people's feelings. Someone might say, I just feel like this is meaningless identity politics. I don't care about this. We cannot monitor how people feel. I hope with information and and knowledge, they grow. But as a company, we can say that it is important that we respect everyone in our workspace, and that using people's preferred pronouns is a way of signaling respect. And so while you may be on an individual journey to better understand this, from a policy perspective, at an institutional level, we absolutely use the pronouns that people ask us to use, right? And so as an institution, we may, and as an organization or company, we may say that, right? But then we could still have microaggressions happening in the workspace, right? Because someone, again, might not use that person's pronouns in conversation with them. And again, it might not be intentional, right? It might not be someone's purposefully saying, I don't care, I'm not going to do it. But even if it's unintentional, right? When that happens, that's a microaggression. And we then have to figure out, as a company and an organization concerned about our culture, our climate and our culture, how do we address that? So some last things I want you to consider. At the personal and organizational level, right, we're going to have to create a culture of accountability. So I always like to say that DEI work is really about creating a culture of accountability. And so we'll want to maybe perhaps, again, thinking about creating spaces within the organization to address microaggressions. They're going to happen, right? It's better to come from a place of recognizing that they're going to happen. They're happening right now in your companies. They're happening right now in my workspace, right? So if they are happening, it's better for us to be proactive and intentional and think about how to address this, right? And so we need to be thinking about what are the messages that we send as a company or organization about our core values, How is HR involved in this process, and what is the messaging that they send, as well as the messaging that they, in policies that they share in terms of how, as an organization, we deal with this? Do we have a mechanism for bias reporting, something that's often anonymous, where people can sort of say, hey, look, I maybe don't want to get this person in trouble, but I want to tell you this is what I'm experiencing, and I hope as an organization we can come up with some ways to deal with it, right? Those are the things that we want to think about. But then we also do want to empower people to begin to think about, at an individual level, how do they address this in the workspace once they recognize that this is a problem, right? So the last 3 points here really sort of talk about the idea of, recognizing that oftentimes, as we talked about with implicit bias, oftentimes this is unintentional, right? People are espousing to really care and value for people holistically, but they might not be aware of the biases that they hold. So when it happens, it's an opportunity to really sort of call out the behavior and not necessarily the person. Now, again, for those of you in HR circles, we know that there are times perhaps where it is a person and it's not just about the behavior, it really is about their personal beliefs and how they act in the workspace. That's different from microaggressions. That's a whole other sort of HR process that we can talk about, right? But in this case, oftentimes, if we go back to the example, someone, I'm just not familiar with pronouns and I just didn't get it right. Right? This is an opportunity, a way to create a workspace where we can gently call in or gently call out people and remind them, hey, I know that this is maybe new for you, but you did use the wrong pronoun for this person. You really got to remember, it's important to honor people and respect them and make sure you're using the right pronouns. Right? If you're the person who's being spoken to as part of developing our cultural competency and also our cultural humility, when you're told that you messed up, it's also part of what we do is to say, yeah, I did, right? To not be defensive, to not want to put walls up and be like, but I didn't mean it, so it's okay. No, it's not okay. Again, it wasn't your intent, but the impact was to make this person feel less than, right? So let's acknowledge that, let's grow from that, and let's really be intentional about not doing that again. And then for others who may witness this in the workspace, right, we want to create a culture and an environment where they feel empowered to be an ally, right? But they also, and we'll talk about this more when we have more time, they also know what it means to be an ally, right? Sometimes for people without deep knowledge, being an ally means sort of stepping over or speaking for someone else. And that's not really what being an ally means. It means being able to, again, draw people into conversation to help them better understand what happened. So again, there's some learning and nuance there. I want to make sure that I get you out of here on time. So the last couple slides I want to share with you. Ultimately, promoting diversity, equity, inclusion in the workplace, we need to practice positive and constructive work habits, right? We need to respect and recognize others in their individuality, right? So that work that we started with and understanding the definitions and understanding what diversity is and how people show up, this is part of promoting diversity, equity, inclusion in our workspace. We want to encourage people to think before they speak. We also want to talk about our differences and ask tactful questions about how they want to be treated. So part of the work that you can be doing with your workforce as you bring people in for trainings and as you think about the culture that you want to cultivate in your workspace, you'll want to be able to talk and acknowledge that there are differences, right? The work that we're doing here is antithetical to a framework, maybe an old paradigm that said that you're just a worker and we don't see you. We are coming from a paradigm that says we see people holistically, and we're doing the work to figure out how to celebrate you as a whole person and celebrate all of you as you walk into the workspace. So it's a fundamentally different paradigm, which is going to then require us to learn the skills to be able to talk about differences, to celebrate differences, and learn how to ask questions of each other. We're also going to need to do the work of eliminating stereotypes and generalizations, right? Because if we think about implicit bias in the ways that maybe that we saw in some of the videos, that comes from stereotypes and generalizations. So we want to be mindful to eliminate that. I want to thank you for being here in our first session. Again, this is our Evolve series, Educated Voices on Leading and Valuing Equality. And we have several sessions planned for our community that are all deeply tied with one another. And again, this first session really was designed to be that 101 course that really kind of gives you an oversight of where we're going and all the topics that we're going to focus on and how we're going to go deeper. On August 20th, our next session is going to focus on generations at work. So we had several questions here today where people wanted to know a little bit more about, well, what are these generational differences and how do they show up in the workplace? And how do we navigate that? So we're going to spend an entire session talking about that. On the 17th of September, we're going to spend an entire session focusing on implicit bias, dive deeper into it, and also dive deeper into the ways in which at an institutional and organizational level we can conquer and minimize implicit bias. And then also on the 15th, we'll follow up that session of implicit bias with microaggressions. And then on the 19th of November, our last session in this year before moving into 2021, we'll focus on DEI strategic planning. So we'll take all of what we've done in those first 4 sessions, and then we'll work specifically with each person in the space to help them think about how, as a decision maker in your workspace, you can help their team develop a strategic plan framed around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So with that, I will end our presentation for today. I'll take any last questions if you have any, and then thank you again for being here. I know that some of you have to run. Yes, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it. And then Amanda, I'll turn it over to you to close us out.
All right, thank you so much, Atia. Sorry, that's my fan there. It's hot in this room. Thank you so much for sharing everything with us. We've got a lot of people saying thank you. And then we've also had a request for your slides. So I will get those from Atia and make sure to share those with everyone that registered. And we, of course, did record this as well as streaming it live to Facebook. So it'll be on Facebook for you. And in a little bit, it'll be on YouTube. So you can share that with people in your organization that maybe couldn't attend or had to run and leave early. So we have all of that. And then we will have registration open for the next session coming up very soon. And we'll hopefully have all of you there for that one too. And then if you have any other questions, you can reply in that email and we will connect with Atia or the other members of our council and get those questions answered for you either on our blog or in an email directly to you. All right. Thank you guys so much for being with us today. We'll see you next time.